And in our passage today, Paul addresses the Christian's relationship to the government. The Christian's relationship to the government. And if I were to summarize our relationship to the government in a single word, that word would be submission. Maybe not the word you wanted me to say, but that's the word. Submission. As Christians, we are commanded to submit to the governing authorities. Now there are some exceptions to this that we'll get into a little bit later in the sermon. So we're not called to blind submission to the government. There are times when it would be right to not submit to the government, but generally speaking, we are called to submit to the governing authorities or the civil authorities, to obey the law, to obey the government, to be law-abiding citizens. Look again at verse 1. Paul says, "Let every soul be subject." So this is a command for every Christian, not just certain Christians. Everyone should submit to the governing authorities. And that means when Paul speaks of the governing authorities here, he means governing authorities at every level of civil government. So he's not just talking about like the highest level of government. He's not saying that we should submit to the governing authorities, of the Congress or the Supreme Court. He's talking about every level of civil authority. And so that includes the police officer who pulls you over for speeding and writes you a ticket. I know who you are. We're to submit to all levels of civil authority. If you look down at verse 4, he tells us those governing authorities are actually God's ministers to you for good. They are God's ordained ministers or God's servants, those civil authorities. They are God's servants ordained by God for your good. And so, instead of having a bad attitude with the police officer who pulls you over and making snarky comments to the police officer, you should thank that police officer for being God's ordained minister to you for your good. Thank you for pulling me over. Thank you for giving me this ticket. So every believer should be submitted to the governing authorities. Even if you don't agree with the governing authorities. Even if you didn't vote for them in the last election. Even if the governing authorities are immoral and passing immoral laws and corrupt. Even if the governing authorities are lying liars and ungodly. He doesn't say submit to governing authorities that do good and are moral and righteous, but you don't have to submit if they're not good and moral and righteous. As Christians, we submit to the governing authorities, whoever the governing authorities happen to be. And again, there's a limit to this. There's a limit to this submission to the governing authorities that we'll talk about in a few moments. But we're to submit to the governing authorities, to the civil authorities. Now, Romans was penned by the Apostle Paul, as you know, and you remember that Paul himself suffered persecution at the hands of the governing authorities. We saw that in the book of Acts. When we studied through the book of Acts, Paul was beaten, he was stoned, he was scourged, he was whipped, he was thrown into prison. Remember, Paul was held in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, and he didn't commit a crime. He was never charged with a crime. He was held in prison for 2 years without a real trial. He was wrongfully imprisoned. He was the victim of a corrupt government and corrupt government officials who were expecting a bribe from Paul. And not only that, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 32, Paul indicates that he fought against wild beasts at Ephesus. He also refers to this in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 17, where he says he was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. And Bible scholars aren't sure if Paul was speaking metaphorically or was he literally delivered from a lion. in Ephesus? Was Paul thrown to the lions by the government officials and miraculously delivered from the lions? And even though Paul suffered persecution personally at the hands of the governing authorities, he writes Romans 13. And he says to us that we should submit to the governing authorities. These governing authorities that greatly mistreated Paul, Paul says we should submit to them. And you remember in the Gospels, the governing authorities condemned Jesus Christ. The religious authorities condemned Jesus Christ to death and handed him over to the civil authorities. And the civil authorities condemned Jesus Christ to be crucified, even though Jesus Christ was innocent. Even though the Roman authority, the governor, Pontius Pilate, declared that Jesus Christ was innocent of any crime, saying, "I find no fault in this man," Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, still condemned Jesus to the cross. And Paul says we are to submit to governing authorities. We're to submit to them.